My name is Rebecca Smith, and this is my lesson plan evaluation for disciplinary literacy. I chose to do my lesson plan evaluation over the lesson plan that centers around Alessandra Putenza's article, What They Did for Their Summer. This article exposes child labor that's still occurring today. And when I first glanced at this article, I thought maybe this is something I can even use in my own classroom because I touch on that very issue when I am teaching the poem The Chimney Sweeper to my students. The Chimney Sweeper is by William Blake, and he through the poem, gives a social critique on child labor during the Industrial Revolution. Many children were sold into workhouses and recruited by master sweepers to work and sweep chimneys. And often they were 2 and 3 years old, and sometimes they even died while they were in the chimneys because of suffocation or you know, just how terrible the living conditions and working conditions were. So I was really excited when I saw this because I thought I could use this to tell students, hey, it's still occurring today. This isn't just a horror from the past. This is something that's still occurring today, and we can connect the past and the present. So for that reason, I was very intrigued to start reading this lesson. As far as writing goes, I definitely feel like it has a very strong writing aspect. In the lesson, it gives six various writing, actually I would say seven writing activities. There are 6 short writing activities, and then there is an essay that students can write. I would say that the 6, I think those should be choices that the students can make rather than they should all get the 6. That the reason that I say that is because I feel like the 6, even though they're higher level thinking and they're great for students to make those connections, if I were to give all 6 of those to my students, they would be overwhelmed and want to just not do it at all. So if I were going to do this lesson, I would make those choices and have my students do maybe 2, especially since they're going to do an essay as well. And so for that reason, I think the writing aspect is strong. I know on one of the activities, it talks about, or several of the activities, it talks about citing evidence from the text, and that's very important. It also talks about analyzing the progression of thought and the claims in the article, which is strong. There's also an activity of comparing and contrasting views, and that's a great activity for students in writing. It's what I appreciated of all of these writing activities is that they all deal with higher order thinking skills with Bloom's taxonomy, and I thought that was great. As far as the essay goes, I thought that wasn't as strong. The activities that they give, those 6 activities are pretty detailed and thought-provoking, and then it has this essay that's like, determine the central idea and give details. And to me, it just seemed a little book report-ish. And so I wasn't a huge fan of that. I'd probably change the writing prompt, but I do think it's a good idea to give an essay after. So overall, I felt like the writing aspect was strong in this lesson. As far as having students interact in an intellectual community, I definitely think this attempts to have students achieve that. It calls for a debate, and I can see where definitely they're sharing their thoughts, they're discussing, and through discussion, they are processing their thinking. Just like in the writing, they're processing their thinking. And so for that, I commend them. They're definitely trying to have students build an intellectual community. My my critique on that, however, I did feel that the article was very biased. I felt like some of the wording was a little deceptive. For instance, it talks about child labor, and when I think of child, I think of little children. When it was mainly, I mean, it did talk about students in their preteens, and I understand that, but then it even talked about some teenagers, and my thought when I was reading this is I thought some of those students would be old enough, or some of those, you know, high school kids would be old enough to be drafted in a war. If they're old enough to be drafted in a war, I think they should be able to work as well. The other thing that I thought is, um, even though some of the arguments that they made were valid, I didn't really appreciate that there wasn't any counterclaims. There wasn't really an opposing view. And even in the lesson, it says, um, that students need to compare and contrast with these views, but the way that they present the other views makes them seem like the bad guys. And I really feel like students need to maybe hear from another view that isn't so biased. An example that I would give is that I grew up in a farming community. My grandparents grew up in a farming community. My dad grew up on a farm. My mom grew up on a farm. And they grew up as children doing chores on the farm. And when I read this, I thought, yeah, like what they're talking about is bad. But at the same time, if some of those restrictions were passed, then would that mean that children that grow up on a farm can't do their chores? You know, and I even thought of when my grandfather, who's 90 years old, when he was growing up, he would get employed as young as 6 years old, and he would make money during the Great Depression. That was something that he was proud of by working on farms, and it wasn't, it wasn't forced labor. He chose to do it, and he was proud of himself, and that led to his successful career as a farmer. And so I feel like there needs to be another view presented, especially for students that don't have any background knowledge when it comes to farming. This debate may be successful with students who are in a farming community and have that background knowledge like I do, of maybe a different viewpoint. But for students who don't have any of that background knowledge and all they have is this article to tell them what to think, it's almost too influential for me. I feel like rather than presenting the facts and letting students come up with their own conclusions, this is kind of telling students what to feel and how to think. And the other thing that I thought as I was reading this article is, why should, I mean, if, especially with the nicotine effects, if people are having the same effects from nicotine in the fields as they would with smoking, then shouldn't those restrictions apply as smoking? You shouldn't be working in the fields under 18 years old. And I understand that. Also, my other question was with the regulations on not hiring, you know, not hiring teenagers that are undocumented. Well, isn't it illegal to hire undocumented people anyway? So why the redundant law? I just felt like there wasn't really an opposing viewpoint that students could argue. So with that, I wonder, how would there even be an effective debate? Because students have one view, and I feel like by reading this article, they would feel guilty in having any other view, because they would think, oh, I'm not compassionate, I'm terrible, if they had any other view. So for that being said, I feel like this lesson should present more views. And if I were to teach this lesson, I would maybe show this article, but then I would show other articles and other viewpoints, especially for those students that don't have that background knowledge to bring to the debate. And I think that would be many in this day and age. I also don't think that this lesson plan adequately gives a project-based activity for students to complete. It does give a graph and asks for students to analyze that graph. But a project-based activity, when I think about that, I think of that being student-centered and that they are the ones completing the project. In this lesson, it appears that the graph is already done and all they have to do is analyze it. And I feel like that would disengage students. And so if I were to teach this lesson, then I would have the students do the research and actually complete the graph. And I feel like that's much more of a project-based activity that would cause students to think like a historian or, you know, a social worker or whatever discipline this lesson requires. I do feel like for that very reason, I don't feel like I can adequately say that this lesson causes students to think in a certain discipline, because it seems to me it's a little bit more passive when it comes to students. The students should not be passive about their learning. They should be active participants. They should be the ones doing the research and coming up with the graphs. They should be given various viewpoints and be able to come up with their own conclusion rather than be guilted into feeling a certain way. And there's definitely pros and cons, but they need to see those sides. They need to be able to formulate their own opinion. And so my overall evaluation of this lesson plan is that I'm pretty critical about it. I definitely would use parts of this lesson plan, but I don't feel like it is complete. And I feel like a lot of work would have to be done for it to be complete and for it to be a strong lesson plan to use in promoting disciplinary literacy. I think it's trying, but it just needs to have more of a well-rounded approach where students can formulate their own opinions, have a more again full debate, knowing all sides, and also taking more of an active approach to the project-based learning. So that is my evaluation for this lesson plan. Thank you for watching.